Welcome back to our Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek, and back with me is Senior Fellow Alan Dowd. Welcome back, Alan.
Good to be back. Good to hear your voice and chat again, Joy.
Yes, it's been a while, so looking forward to getting into your articles that we have missed.
Me too.
And today we're going to discuss Ukraine and Russia, the stalemate there, and if they can come to a peace plan or agreement. Alan wrote two articles since we've talked last, one in April titled Preparing for a Cold Peace in Ukraine, and his latest article, An Imperfect but Durable Peace. And you can find all of Alan's articles on our website at www.ascf.us. Please consider becoming a member of the ASCF for $100 a year, which is a little less than $10 a month. It includes a paid Substack subscription, which is worth $80, and our bi-weekly newsletter. So, Alan, as we have heard or know, President Biden signed the aid package for Ukraine to receive $61 billion in military aid. And other European nations have been already aiding Ukraine and even signing security cooperation agreements, according to your latest article here that we will dive into.
Right.
First, do you believe this latest aid package from the U.S., along with other European help, is enough to make Russia consider coming to the table and bringing some peace terms to an end, or maybe a current end? No.
Regrettably, no. I think the time for that, Joy, and I don't get into it in the series of articles we're publishing there at ASCF, the time for that, I think, is past. There probably was a window of that for that to be possible when Russia was really on its heels, and both militarily, and then also some of the internal politics. We saw, an attempted coup, an outright mutiny, really. So that may have been the perfect time. And if Ukraine had the tools at that time to press the offensive and really to push the Russians out of those occupied territories in the east, I think the Russians might have been ready to talk peace. There were some fake peace talks, you may recall, and the listeners may recall, in 2022. And I say fake because the Russians were not negotiating. All the reports show that the Russians were saying, yes, we'll stop fighting if you agree to our terms. Well, that's not a peace talk. That's not a negotiation. That's an ultimatum. And Russia was not really in the position to do that. Ukraine didn't take that offer, which wasn't much of an offer. And now we are 2 years later looking at a situation where Ukraine has not been able to maintain the momentum of its successes of 23 and late 22. Russia has picked up some basically abandoned villages in most cases. The front moves 100 yards here and there, it sounds like. Mm-hmm. But Russia has clearly stopped Ukraine's momentum, and Russia has, I don't think there's any chance that they're going to say, uncle, and we'll talk peace right now. Now, on the other side, the Ukrainians, and it's not just the Ukrainian government, it sounds like the Ukrainian people as well, are in no mood for peace either, to talk terms for peace. They want their territory to be liberated of Russian occupiers. Mm. So the two sides are very far apart, as my first article talks about.
Right.
And really, when I talk about, and you mentioned the title of the article, Preparing for a Cold Peace, and the second one is How Can We Get Toward an Imperfect but Durable Peace? My starting point, Joy, and it's been the starting point, I think, of the Biden administration and of most members of NATO, is we should support Ukraine getting to what they define as peace. So if Zelensky and his people, his government, get to the point where they say, we cannot push the Russians out any further, we're ready to talk peace, then we should support that. But until then, I think we should give them the tools to defend their territory and to push Russians out of as much of their territory as possible. Remember, this is a war of aggression. There's no debate about that. Mm-hmm. launched by Russia against Ukraine, a country at which it was at peace, in violation of existing conventions, treaties, and norms of international behavior. Ukraine is on the just side of this war and prosecuting a just war of self-defense.
Well, and which is why I brought up stalemate, and you did
Right.
as well in your papers, because Russia
Correct.
is not willing to give in. Ukraine doesn't seem to be willing to give in. So which kind
They're
of
far
leads
apart.
me into my next question of do you think Ukraine would be willing to cede the Donbass region for a peace agreement with Russia and possible lasting security agreements with U.S. and other allied nations?
Not right now, and I don't see it in the near term. And until or unless the Ukrainian government says concludes we cannot can continue this kind of war of attrition, or until the Ukrainian government changes, and that's possible. Ukraine is a democracy at war. Russia is a dictatorship at war. There's very different political dynamics in those two cases. It's a myth, as you know, and I think our listeners know that democracies are at a disadvantage in war. I think democracies are generally, history shows, at a disadvantage early in a war, but as the war drags on, actually dictatorships become more at risk. And we saw, last summer, June, a mutiny and an attempted coup that got within miles of Moscow. Russian elements of the Russian army didn't, whether or not they quit, they didn't fight the coup plotters down in the southern part of Russia as they gained momentum. But that's kind of a separate issue. The real issue right now is this Ukrainian government, the Zelensky government. It just seems to me is nowhere near saying we're ready to give up land for peace. And that's partly because of the nature of the enemy they're facing, the nature of the war that enemy has inflicted upon Ukraine, and also the fact that Russia, this goes back to the nature of the Putin regime, Russia is not an enemy that you can trust. I mean, Russia, this war really begins in 2014, as you know, not in 2022 when Putin, through hybrid warfare tactics, seized Crimea and then armed Russian separatists, Russian ethnic groups, and used unmarked Russian armies really to take what you mentioned, the Donbass region. So with that kind of enemy, I think the Zelensky government and the Ukrainian people have no desire to trade land for peace, and don't think it would work either.
Understandably so, and that's a really good point, because I personally thought that something should have been done when Russia annexed Crimea without really any repercussions whatsoever.
For sure.
It's led now him to be even more aggressive, and we're at where we are now. Absolutely,
you're right, and many of us were saying that. I don't think you and I were working together in 2014 yet, but you're absolutely right. Many of us were saying that, writing that in 2014. It was a huge failure of American leadership in 2014. One of the most stinging, scathing, humiliating comments that I think probably goes down in history attached to American policymaking was issued by the president of Ukraine at that time, who's no longer president. He was invited to speak at our Capitol at a joint session of Congress, and he said, "One cannot win a war with blankets," because that's all the Obama administration was sending. Non-lethal aid was all they sent in 2014, and the results were predictable and predicted, but a scathing indictment of American policy making and failure of American leadership at the time in 2014. So you're absolutely right on that. Can't go back in time. The Biden administration has done pretty well at getting equipment to the Ukrainians and cajoling the Europeans to get on board. You mentioned in your intro, the Europeans actually are giving more military and humanitarian aid than the United States has. And that's something that's been either underreported or even just overlooked during the debate over Ukraine aid that took a brutal 5 months for the Congress to finally pass that. They passed it. I don't think it's too little too late, but it is late, and it cost the Ukrainians men and territory and momentum.
Yes, and you and I discussed this on another podcast, I believe, because we were talking about the American people's desire to also see our own southern border taken care of. But
right, and that was it was a good discussion we had. I know it's in our archives, our podcast archives, but the main point on that one, and that was addressed during the final vote on the Ukraine aid debate, was we can do both. A deal was offered to do both, and a fringe group in Congress, in the House, rejected that deal. And so, thankfully, in my view, a majority got the bill passed, and the aid is flowing to Ukraine and other democratic partners. But it is interesting that some European countries, I talk about them in these essays, are moving forward with security promises, security guarantees, and security avenues to deliver aid over the long term to Ukraine. So they're already thinking about the day after a peace or an armistice is signed. And the British kind of have led the way in that regard. The Germans have signed a deal, and they're very specific. I include links. I think a lot of Americans are unaware of how detailed and specific and ironclad these agreements are between individual European powers and the Ukrainian government. The French have signed. The French President Macron has been very vocal about even possibly sending French troops. The Italians, the Poles, they've all put together bilateral deals with Ukrainians, and I think we'll see more of that. By the way, Joy, out of or ahead of or around the NATO summit, which will be here in the United States in July. I think there'll be more of those that kind of come out, bilateral deals, and maybe some more things that NATO itself will be doing as an alliance to help Ukraine.
Yes, and you bring up a good leadway into another question I had, because I was reading all these, and actually, to be honest with you, I was not aware as how detailed these security agreements are with Britain, Germany, France, Italy, you mentioned, right. Poland, and even Japan.
Yeah.
And interestingly, they also talk about NATO aspirations and possible consideration. And I go back to your first article, and I just wanted to read with our listeners here. You had put, history reminds us that neither lingering territorial disputes or simmering hostilities are deal breakers when it comes to providing security to allies and partners in the crosshairs. So right. Is NATO any option at all on the table, do we think?
Well, the answer to that is that's a good question and a loaded question, and that was really the core of that first article. Is I was making the case that if we get to a point, if the Ukrainians and the Russians get to a point, and again, my starting point is what Ukraine defines as victory or peace, when they're ready to agree to some type of a war-ending deal. We get to that point, it's likely that some land will be involved in that. There's a lot of wars you and I have studied, you and I have talked about over the last 500 years, but even over the last century, where somehow land is exchanged to bring about some type of deal or peace deal. Most wars don't end with unconditional surrender and total victory. But if we can get to that point, it is possible that even a Ukraine that doesn't look the way it did before 2014 could be brought into security structures, Western security structures, including NATO. NATO offered membership to Ukraine in 2008, but didn't say when Ukraine could come in. It said Ukraine would someday join NATO. NATO didn't offer what's known as a membership action plan, which is a pathway to membership. It was a very bad compromise, I guess you could say, between a group led by the United States within NATO and a group led by France and Germany within NATO. The French and German bloc within NATO did not want didn't want Ukraine in Georgia, by the way, to come in to NATO. Didn't think it was time. The U.S.-led bloc thought it was time and that it was important to bring security to those countries, and then ultimately that affects the rest of NATO's security. I agree with the Bush administration in 2008. I wrote about that in 2008. But NATO operates under consensus. Everybody has to agree, or it doesn't happen. It is not a dictatorship that the United States runs. All that is a tee up or a lead up to the idea that, getting to the crux of your question, that it's not unthinkable that Ukraine, post-war Ukraine, a militarily hardened, militarily proven, a country that has proven its commitment to Western values, that has literally fought for the principles and the norms of the liberal international order that we talk about, we in America, NATO talk about all the time, that a post-war Ukraine could, in my view, come into NATO. And the historical examples are West Germany came into NATO, including, by the way, West Berlin. There was no territorial agreement about Germany, the two Germanys. The United States, in fact, didn't recognize officially, now by de facto we did, but officially in a legal document, the post-World War II territorial boundaries in Europe until the 1970s under the Helsinki Accords. So West Germany, including West Berlin, which was surrounded, as you know, by East Germany and Soviet divisions, came into NATO. That's an example that it could happen. Also, post-war Japan, there are territories to this day that Japan recognizes are Japanese territory, but are not under Japanese jurisdiction because the Russians hold them. Also, Korea, the Korean Peninsula, despite territorial disagreements, despite the absence of a real peace treaty, as you know, Joy, and I don't know if all of our listeners remember or realize, that's just an armistice. The war was paused in summertime 1953. Now, we can hope and pray it never is restarted, but that's not a ironclad peace treaty. But despite that, the U.S. gave security guarantees to Korea. Despite the situation with Japan and the Soviet Union and now Russia, the U.S. gave security guarantees to Japan. And of course, I mentioned Germany as well. So there is historical precedent for the U.S. and its allies bringing in hard security guarantees, even into treaties, even into multi-nation treaties like NATO, North Atlantic Treaty. There's historical precedent for that happening. So I think it could be possible that a post-war Ukraine could come into NATO, even if it was not the 2014 borders of Ukraine.
And
if that happened,
2008, if they had, I would think that if they had allowed Ukraine in 2008, we would not have what we have now.
Oh, that's a very shrewd comment, Joy, and it's an ongoing debate between groups who support basically free countries joining NATO and groups who blame NATO for Russia's behavior, which I totally disagree with that second group. So your, I think, assessment is correct. Vladimir Putin respects Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which is the all for one, one for all clause. It says an attack on one will trigger a defense of that one nation under attack. He respects that. Now, I don't know how long he will, but he respects that. The reason I think that, or I can say that, is he hasn't attacked Poland, the Baltic states, which were part of the Soviet Union, for goodness sake, illegally, but they were part of the Soviet Union for decades. But he has attacked, all those countries are members of NATO, by the way, but he has attacked Georgia and Ukraine. He has left huge numbers of Russian troops in Moldova. All those countries are democracies. All those countries are under threat or under attack by Russia, and none of them are members of NATO. I think there's no coincidence in that. So I think your comment is correct. It would have been a headache. there were huge issues with whether Ukraine was ready in 2008. I get the Germans and the French point. To join NATO, you have to get to a certain level of, you have to have no territorial disputes. That's a big deal. You have to get to a certain level of, making sure there's rule of law in your country. Corruption issues were a big issue in Ukraine in 2008. So I understand that. But for really what NATO did was the worst of both worlds, if you think about it, 2008. If they had said, you're joining now, it's done, and all 28 members at the time or what have you said it, that's it, then Ukraine had been in and it had been secure, and NATO would have been secure. If it had said, it's not the time and we don't know when it will be, we hope it happens one day, that would have been probably better than you're going to join at some time. There's an invitation on the table, but you're not ready yet. That gave Vladimir Putin a really, if not a green light, a very weak yellow light, to intervene and try to have his way with Georgia and Ukraine. And he, to this day, occupies a big chunk of Georgia. Mm-hmm. In 2008, he moved against Georgia not long after, just months after NATO put Georgia and Ukraine on the shelf, basically. In the August War, the Olympic War of 2008, he invaded Georgia. The only reason he didn't get to Tbilisi, by the way, in 2008 was because the United States rushed through the U.S. Transport planes, rushed Georgian troops that were helping us in Iraq in a peacekeeping effort, cracked Georgian troops from Iraq into Georgia in a pretty daring and unappreciated effort by the U.S. U.S. Air Force airlift to get those troops into what amounted to a war zone, from one war zone to another, really, Iraq to Georgia. And those troops were able to kind of deflect or parry the Russian blow, because Putin wanted to get to Tbilisi. Georgia's a much smaller country, as you know, than Ukraine, but he didn't. So there's a lot of recent history that complicates this, but I do think that a post-war Ukraine could be in NATO. I know that a post-war Ukraine would be a valuable member of NATO. It'd be one of the strongest militaries. It's literally fought for Europe. It's with blood. It is fought for Europe and for the principles that people like your and my grandfathers fought for in the 1940s.
And I kind of snickered earlier because it seems you're right in step with my questions here, because my next one was leading right into what you're saying is, in your opinion,
think alike.
Would allowing Ukraine into NATO, or for that matter, Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, push Putin further to move on to invade other Russian satellites, as we discussed, Georgia, Moldova?
It could speed up his calculus or speed up his desire or his efforts to reconstruct the Russian Empire. That's not a debatable point anymore. He clearly believes that his mission is to be a new Tsar Peter, new Peter the Great. But effectively, I don't know what territories beyond Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova that NATO would be involved in, to be honest, if he moved against the stand.
You made a point that Poland, I know there was concern there, but I think you're right. He respects that Article 5.
Right. I'm setting it. So yeah, I don't think he will. I mean, think about this: if he attacks Poland or the Baltics, that Article 5 has to immediately come into play, and then we're at war with Russia, a direct war, not a proxy war, a direct war. And by the way, if we weren't to come to the aid of Poland or the Baltics, that would mean the end of NATO. I mean, that would mean NATO Article 5. Has only been invoked one time. It was in 2001 when the United States was attacked, not European nations, and not by Moscow. It was attacked, as you know, by a terrorist organization. What I'm saying is, if Ukraine were to enter into NATO membership, at that point, Ukraine's off the table for Putin. Would they bring Georgia and Ukraine at the same time? I don't know. Georgia may not be on right now. There's huge, as you've watched, there's huge maybe a brewing revolution in Georgia right now. Huge demonstrations, pro-democracy, by the way, or pro-freedom, pro-West, pro-EU demonstrations there against a government that seems to be in the back pocket of, or at least somehow under the puppet strings of Moscow. But I'm sure, I mean, Putin wants to reconstruct the Russian Empire. That's why defeating him in Ukraine is so important, because if you're able to do that, if we're able to do that, the Ukrainians fighting with their blood and sweat and tears, the Americans, Europeans sending huge amounts of military and humanitarian and economic aid to keep the Ukrainian government running, keep the Ukrainian state alive. If we're able to stop him there, then his project, I would submit, is over, is his rebuilding project. If he wins there, or if he is able to say, I won there, if he gets half of Ukraine, let alone if he's able to create a rump Ukraine and assassinate or send a free Ukrainian government into exile, then his project will get momentum, and then he could very well turn his sights on Poland and the Baltics, which are in his sights, I guess I could say. Then he would just focus his energies on that. I can tell you this, though, if you look at what Poland in specific and NATO in general are doing in Poland and the Baltics, that would not be an easy fight for anyone to invade. I mean, the Poles are investing 4% of GDP in defense. That's double what NATO asks. It's far more than what most members. They're bringing in American and Korean tanks and artillery, joint strike, F-35 fighters. So you got fifth generation warplanes. There are American troops in Poland at a permanent basis, which I was calling for the last decade. And there are, and of course, there are a whole bunch of NATO battalions across the Baltic. So NATO's getting serious. It's late, but I think Ukraine kind of became an impetus for NATO to get serious about defending the eastern flank. But Ukraine's important, I think, to the next chapter in this Russia-NATO story.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. I appreciate your insight on this and both of your articles.
Always enjoyed chatting with you. Great questions and comments, Joy.
And to our listeners, as I mentioned earlier, you can read all of Alan's articles at our website, www.ascf.us. They will go up on the front page, but they're under Dowd's section at this moment. Please also subscribe, comment, and share this podcast. We are on YouTube and Rumble channels by typing in American Security Council Foundation, and also check out our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at ASCF-US, and consider becoming a member of the ASCF. Thank you, Alan. Thank you to our listeners. And join us again next time for more Peace Through Strength podcasts.